April 16th, 1945. A cellar beneath a shattered guild hall in Wuppertal, Germany. The world has shrunk to the smell of damp earth, stale sweat, and cordite. For 20-year-old Anneliese Schmidt, a former signals auxiliary for the Wehrmacht, this is the end of the Reich. It tastes like dust. Above, the city of her youth is a symphony of destruction, the grinding growl of American armor replacing the familiar sounds of trams and church bells. The low, concussive whump of artillery still shakes the stone walls, sifting fine powder from the ceiling onto their hair and shoulders. There are a dozen of them down here, women and girls who had served the Reich in capacities deemed safe from the front. Clerks, communicators, supply assistants. Now, the front had come to them. Their last orders had come from a Wehrmacht Hauptmann with eyes like cracked glass, his uniform torn and stained. Hold until relieved. Relief was a fantasy. A few blocks away, the 78th U.S. Infantry Division was methodically erasing the last pocket of resistance. The Hauptmann had tried to organize a defense with a handful of weary teenage boys from the Volkssturm and a single sputtering MG-42. It lasted 7 minutes. The brutal, hammering chatter of the machine gun was answered by a deafening storm of American fire. The sound of an M4 Sherman's main gun firing at point-blank range had turned the building across the street to rebel and silenced the Hauptmann forever. Then the Americans came. They moved with an unhurried, terrifying efficiency. Big men in mud-caked uniforms, their faces grim and unreadable behind helmets draped in camouflage netting. Shouts in English echoed in the streets, a language that sounded harsh, alien. Anneliese and the other women had been herded from their command post, hands raised high, hearts pounding against their ribs. They were pushed down the cellar steps into the waiting dark. They expected the worst. Propaganda Minister Goebbels had painted vivid pictures for them their entire lives. The Americans were gangsters, savages, tools of international Jewry who would defile and destroy everything German. Their final moment of German authority came not from a hero, but from a phantom. A Feldgendarmerie corporal, face pale with fanatical terror, had appeared in the cellar doorway, just as the first American boots hit the floorboards above. He held a length of crude iron chain. "They will show you no mercy," he hissed, his voice trembling. "They will do to you what they did to the women of Aachen. Remember your duty. Do not talk. Do not surrender your honor." He moved with frantic speed, looping the chain through their cuffed wrists, binding them together in a clumsy, rattling line. It was a chain meant for securing cargo, not people. The cold, rough metal bit into their skin. He locked the final link with a heavy padlock, then scrambled back up the steps, promising to make the Americans pay for every inch. A single shot, followed by a heavy thud, suggested his promise was short-lived. Now they wait in the gloom, bound together. The youngest, a 17-year-old named Greta, is sobbing quietly. An older woman, Frau Keller, a bursar's assistant with graying hair, tries to comfort her with whispered words. But they all believe the same thing. The chains are a prelude. This is how it begins. The air is thick with the anticipation of violence. Every creak of the floorboards above is a footstep. Every distant shout is an order for their abuse. Anneliese closes her eyes, trying to compose herself, to find the stoic resolve the party had always demanded. But all she can feel is the crude iron on her wrist and the suffocating certainty of what comes next. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stone steps groans open, flooding the space with gray, dusty light. A silhouette fills the frame. It is broad, holding a rifle. The M1 Guardian. An American soldier is looking down at them. The cellar falls completely, deathly silent.
The American soldier stood there for a long moment, a dark shape against the stark light. He didn't move, didn't speak. You could feel his gaze sweeping over the huddled group, taking in the scene. Anneliese held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the hand of the woman next to her. The soldier's stillness was more unnerving than a shout would have been. He was assessing them, judging them. Finally, he turned and called out to someone above, his voice low and flat, the words lost in their alien cadence. "Hey, Sart, better come take a look at this." Another silhouette appeared, this one wearing the stripes of a non-commissioned officer on his sleeve. He descended the first few steps, his boots crunching on loose debris. He stopped, peering into the gloom, his eyes adjusting. This was Sergeant Frank Miller, Company C, 311th Infantry Regiment. He was 22, but the war had aged him. He'd seen the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen hell of the Ardennes, and the bloody crossing of the Rhine. He was tired of death, tired of ruins, tired of Germany. He saw the women huddled against the far wall, and then he saw the glint of metal that connected them. He frowned, his brow furrowing under the rim of his M1 helmet. He came the rest of the way down the steps, his Garand held loosely at his side. Another GI followed him, rifle at the ready, covering the doorway. Miller walked slowly toward the women, his movements deliberate. They flinched as one, a ripple of fear passing through the group. He stopped about 10 feet away. He wasn't looking at their faces, but at their hands, at the ugly, rust-flecked chain binding them wrist to wrist. He'd seen German soldiers chained by their own military police to prevent retreat, but this was different. He scanned their uniforms. They were auxiliaries, not SS fanatics from the Gestapo headquarters down the street. Just women caught in the gears of a collapsing machine. He let out a long, weary sigh. "Jesus Christ," he muttered to the private behind him. "Who the hell does this?" He raised his eyes and met Annaliese's. She stared back, her expression a mask of terrified defiance. She expected a sneer, a curse, a blow. Instead, the sergeant's face showed nothing but a deep, profound weariness. He looked away from them, up toward the light, and spoke into his radio handset. His voice was calm, professional. "Baker 6, this is Baker 2 Charlie. Got about a dozen female POWs down here. Non-combatants. Yeah, auxiliaries. No, I don't know who did it. Stand by." The wait was an eternity. The two soldiers stood guard, their presence filling the small space. They didn't speak to the women. They barely spoke to each other. One of them pulled out a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes and lit one, the flare of the match briefly illuminating his young, grime-streaked face. The smell of American tobacco, sweet and foreign, filled the musty air. Above, the sounds of the war machine continued. The rumble of a half-track, the methodical shouted orders, the crackle of a field radio. It was the sound of their world being dismantled and replaced by another. For Annalise and the others, every second stretched into a minute. They whispered amongst themselves in frightened German. "What are they waiting for? An officer to decide our fate. They are bringing tools." The prophecy of the dead felt Gendarmerie Corporal echoed in their minds. The Americans were savages. The chains were just the beginning. Frau Keller began to quietly recite the Lord's Prayer, her voice a thin, trembling thread in the suffocating silence. Annalise watched Sergeant Miller. He seemed oblivious to their terror, his attention focused on the world above. He was just a functionary, a cog. Was this the face of a monster? This tired boy from Ohio or Texas who looked like he hadn't slept in a week? The propaganda posters showed slavering, beast-like caricatures. This was just a man. And that was somehow more frightening. The man was a mystery. A monster's actions were predictable. The radio on Miller's belt crackled to life. He listened, nodded. "Roger that?" He turned to the private. "Go get Smitty from 3rd Platoon. Tell him to bring the cutters." The private nodded and jogged up the steps. Cutters. The word needed no translation. The women fell silent, their eyes wide with a shared, unspoken dread. A tool for cutting wire, or chain, or bone. The cellar door swung open again, casting a long shadow down the steps. The private returned, and with him was another soldier, a big man carrying a pair of heavy, long-handled bolt cutters. He paused at the top of the stairs, a grim silhouette holding the instrument of their impending torment.
The soldier they called Smitty was a giant, his frame filling the cellar entrance. In his hands, the bolt cutters looked less like a tool and more like a weapon. He descended the stone steps with a heavy tread, each footfall echoing the frantic beat of Annalise's heart. He didn't look at the women. His focus was on the task, his expression one of professional detachment. Sergeant Miller gestured with his head. "Let's get this over with." Miller took a step forward. The line of women shrank back against the damp stone wall, the chain rattling with their collective tremor. Greta, the youngest, let out a small, choked cry. Annalise squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. She recited the names of her brothers, both lost on the Eastern Front, a private litany against the encroaching terror. This was it, the moment the radio broadcasts had warned her about, the fulfillment of all the dark prophecies. But the expected blow,
The rough hands, the violation, none of it came. Instead, a voice cut through the tension. It was quiet, almost gentle. "Easy now. It's all right." It was Sergeant Miller, speaking in English. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was not. It was calming, reassuring. Annalise cautiously opened her eyes. Miller was kneeling. He wasn't looking at them with lust or hatred. He was looking at the padlock that secured the chain around the first woman's wrist, Frau Keller. He examined it for a moment, then gestured for Smitty to move in. Frau Keller began to pray louder, her voice shaking uncontrollably. Smitty braced the hardened steel jaws of the bolt cutters around the thick shackle of the padlock. He adjusted his grip, his muscles tensing. Annalise watched, mesmerized by the impending act, the sheer physics of it, the application of force. She anticipated a scream, a struggle. Instead, there was only a single, sharp, shockingly loud sound. Snap. The padlock sprang open, useless. Smitty pulled it away. Miller reached forward and carefully unwound the chain from Frau Keller's wrist. For a moment, the older woman simply stared, her mouth agape. She looked at her freed hand, then at the American sergeant, her eyes filled with a profound, shattering disbelief. The soldiers ignored her. They were already moving down the line. Smitty positioned cutters on the link connecting Frau Keller to the next woman. Snap! A second crack echoed in the silence. Another link severed. The heavy chain fell to the stone floor with a dull clank. One by one, they moved along the line of prisoners. Snap! Clank! Snap! Clank! The rhythm was methodical, efficient, and utterly devoid of malice. It was the sound of liberation, but it felt like the world turning upside down. When they reached Annalise, she didn't flinch. She watched, transfixed, as Miller gently took her wrist to steady it. His hand was calloused and dirty, but his touch was surprisingly careful. Smitty brought the cutters into place. The cold metal pressed against the iron link near her skin. She looked up into Sergeant Miller's face. He met her gaze for a fraction of a second. There was nothing there but tired professionalism. He wasn't freeing a German. He was just fixing a problem. Snap! The tension on her arm vanished. The weight was gone. The chain slithered from her wrist and clattered onto the pile on the floor. She stared at the faint red chafe mark on her skin. It was the only evidence that she had ever been bound. The girls around her were doing the same, rubbing their wrists, looking at their hands as if they were alien objects. The fear that had held them in its icy grip for hours was beginning to sublimate, turning into a vapor of pure, disorienting confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. Barbarians didn't bring bolt cutters, they brought knives and fists. They didn't remove chains, they added them. Sergeant Miller stood up, surveying his work. He nudged the pile of discarded iron with the toe of his boot. He looked at the stunned faces of the women and saw their confusion. He didn't have the words in German to explain the Geneva Convention, or the regulations of the U.S. Army regarding the treatment of prisoners, or the simple fact that he was just a decent kid from Indiana who wanted the war to be over. So he found the only phrase he could muster, something he'd picked up from a leaflet. He pointed at the chain on the floor. Nicht nötig, he said, his accent thick. Not necessary. Then, more to himself and to Smitty, he added in English. You don't need these anymore. He turned and gestured with his head toward the stairs. All right, let's go. On your feet. Rouse. The command was sharp, but not cruel. It was time to leave the darkness of the cellar. It was time to face the daylight, and a reality that was suddenly, terrifyingly, nothing like they had been told.
Emerging from the cellar was like being born into a world of ruins. The gray Wuppertal sky pressed down, heavy with the smoke of smoldering buildings. Annalise blinked, her eyes struggling to adjust to the light. The first thing she noticed was the scale of it all. The American presence was not a raiding party. It was an ecosystem. The street, littered with the debris of battle, spent casings, discarded ration tins, the sad, broken body of the Hauptmann's MG-42, was now an artery of the U.S. Army. Jeeps, their engines buzzing like angry insects, darted between hulking GMC trucks. A Sherman tank, its long 76mm gun pointing lazily down the street, sat parked in what used to be a flower garden, its crew sitting on the hull, smoking and talking with casual indifference. This indifference was the second shock. As the dozen women were led into the ruined town square, almost no one paid them any attention. A few GIs glanced over, their expressions more of curiosity than malice, before turning back to their tasks, cleaning a rifle, unspooling communications wire, uncrating boxes of ammunition. The women, who had been taught to believe they were the prime objects of the enemy's hatred and lust, were a complete non-event. They were merely administrative debris to be swept up after the storm of combat had passed. This casual disregard was more profoundly dismissive of their ideology than any act of cruelty could have been. They were not worthy of hate.
They were just prisoners. They were marched to a provisional collection point set up in the courtyard of a heavily damaged school. Chalkboards with German grammar exercises were still visible through shattered windows. A young corporal with glasses sat at a folding table with a typewriter, methodically processing a long line of male prisoners, old men from the Volkssturm and hollow-eyed boys from the Hitler Youth. Their bravado evaporated, leaving only a bewildered fear. The women were told to stand to one side and wait. A medic came over and looked them over with a practiced eye, checking for wounds. He offered a canteen of water, and the women drank greedily. It was clean, tasting faintly of chlorine and metal. Annalise watched the Americans. They were so loud. They laughed easily. They chewed gum constantly, their jaws working with a rhythmic motion. They moved with a loose-limbed confidence that spoke of a nation that had never known bombs or invasion. One soldier, seeing 17-year-old Greta start to cry again, walked over. He was impossibly young, with a face full of freckles. He said something in English she didn't understand, then broke off a piece of a dark, rich-smelling chocolate bar and held it out. Greta hesitated, then took it, her hand trembling. She nibbled it, and her crying subsided. Annalise felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. A simple piece of Hershey's chocolate was doing more to dismantle her worldview than 1,000 Allied bombs. Every detail was a contradiction. The newsreels had shown American soldiers as degenerate subhumans. These men were just men. They were tired, they were dirty, they missed home. They treated their prisoners not with rage, but with a kind of bureaucratic weariness. Annalise thought of her brother, Hans, who had written from Stalingrad about the fight against the Bolshevik hordes. He had died believing he was saving civilization from barbarians. Had he been wrong? Had they all been wrong? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. If this was a lie, the foundational lie of her entire existence, what else was untrue? The purity of the race? The destiny of the Reich? The Führer's infallibility? The structure of her world, built on a scaffold of absolute certainty, was beginning to groan and splinter. The truth was not a heroic last stand in a blaze of glory. The truth was paperwork, and an enemy who gave chocolate to crying girls. A shadow fell over them. An American officer, a captain, stood before them. He was older than the others, his face lined with fatigue, but his uniform was clean. He held a clipboard. He looked them over, his gaze sharp and intelligent. He stopped in front of Annalise, perhaps because she was the one who met his eyes directly. He looked at the insignia on her collar, identifying her as a Nockertal-Halerfin. He cleared his throat and then spoke, his German formal and precise, with only a slight accent. "Which of you were in the Signals Corps?" The question was not an accusation. It was a practical inquiry. The war was not over for him. He needed information. But for Annalise, it was a terrifying bridge, linking the life that had just ended to an unknown future she was now forced to enter.
Annalise's throat was dry. She nodded, unable to speak. "I was," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. The captain's expression didn't change. He made a note on his clipboard. "Come with me," he said, not unkindly. Two of the other women who had worked in the communications bunker also identified themselves and were motioned to follow. They were led into what had once been the headmaster's office. A map of the Ruhr region was spread across a large desk, marked with grease pencil symbols and arrows. The interrogation, if it could be called that, was devoid of threats or intimidation. The captain, whose name was Davies, simply asked questions. What was the last unit you were in contact with? Where were their headquarters located? What were the frequencies you were using? It was a cold, professional exercise in information extraction. He offered them coffee, a bitter, powerful brew served in tin mugs. Annalise answered what she knew. The 9th Panzer Division's last known position, the call signs for General Feldmarschall Model's Army Group B. Each piece of information she gave felt like a betrayal, yet the concept of loyalty had become abstract and meaningless in the last few hours. Loyalty to what? To the dead Hauptmann? To the fanatical corporal with his chains? To a Reich that now existed only in shattered concrete and columns of defeated men? She was answering questions about a ghost army in a ghost country. When it was over, they were led back outside. The process was moving forward. The women were directed toward a large canvas-covered GMC truck, its engine rumbling impatiently. They were helped onto the back by a soldier who gave them a half smile. As the truck lurched into motion, beginning its slow journey out of the ruined city, Annalise looked out at her homeland. The scenes that unfolded were ones of total, abject defeat. Mile after mile, they passed endless columns of German prisoners, men in the faded field gray of the Wehrmacht, boys in the ill-fitting black uniforms of the Hitler Youth, old men in the armbands of the Volkssturm. Their faces were blank, their shoulders slumped. They walked with the shuffling gait of men who had nowhere left to go. From every farmhouse and village window hung a white flag, a bedsheet, a tablecloth, a dish rag. A nation was surrendering. Annalise looked down at her own wrist. The red mark from the chain was already fading. The physical restraint was gone, but she had never felt more imprisoned. The chain had represented a clear, understandable fate. She was a soldier of the Reich, captured by a brutal enemy, and she would face a martyr's end. It was a terrifying narrative, but it was a narrative nonetheless. It had structure, purpose. This new reality had none. She was a prisoner of an enemy that was not monstrous, a survivor of a cause that was built on lies, a citizen of a nation that no longer existed. What was she supposed to do now? Where was she supposed to go? Freedom from the chain was not liberation. It was a terrifying vacuum. The truck convoy stopped briefly at a crossroads to allow a column of American tanks to pass. Annalise glanced at the GIs directing traffic and saw a familiar figure, Sergeant Miller. He was leaning against a jeep, drinking from a canteen. He happened to look up, and his eyes met hers across the 20 yards of dusty road. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply held her gaze for a moment, and in his tired eyes she saw not enmity or triumph, but a flicker of something that looked like shared understanding, a mutual recognition of their shared condition as two young people caught in the fast and personal machinery of history. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned away to his duties, and the moment was gone. That simple human gesture was the final blow. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that stripped away the uniforms, the ideologies, and the hatred, leaving only the wreckage. The truck's engine roared back to life, and they continued their journey toward a prisoner of war enclosure and an uncertain future. Annalise Schmidt, formerly of the German Signal Corps, leaned her head back against the rough canvas of the truck. The chains were gone, the fear was gone, but in their place was the crushing, terrifying weight of having to live in the world that came next.